Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. In 2019, the Modi government set a target for India to become a $5 trillion economy by financial year 2024-2025. But a book that is recently published has made crystal clear that this is simply not going to be the case. And here's the book. It's called The $10 Trillion Dream. And its author is former Economic Affairs Secretary and former Finance Secretary Subhash Chandra Garg. Mr. Garg, in your book, The $10 Trillion Dream, you say bluntly, the goal of a $5 trillion economy by 2024-25 is beyond India's reach. Can you explain why you've come to this conclusion?
Thank you, Mr. Thapar. I think it's very simple. We have lost 2 years. Completely. In fact, the 3 years since the goal was set on the base of 1819, 3 years of 1920, 2021, and 21-22, in dollar terms have generated growth of only 4%. In real economy, our growth is about 1.7%, 1.8%. The target which was set for 24-25, which on 1819 meant about 6 years or so, required a growth of, in dollar terms, about 11 to 12% per annum, nominal in dollar terms. Now, if we have grown only by about 4% in first 3 years, you can't achieve the required growth of about 12%. You would require a growth of 17% in the remaining 3 years if you want to achieve that target, which is almost impossible, even if you assume that the rupee will not depreciate against dollar. And therefore, I think the conclusion is very obvious. Thanks to the loss of 2 years in COVID times, 21, 22, and the slow growth of 1920 of less than 4% is responsible for India not being in a position.
Now, as you point out in your book, the target was first announced by the Prime Minister when he spoke to Niti Aayog in June 2019, and it was then repeated by Nirmala Sitharaman in her first budget of July 2019. And at that time, you were the finance secretary. When the target was set, did you believe it was a realistic target which could be met? Or even then, did you have concerns that this was verging on the hubristic?
So the announcement was made on 15th of June when the NDC or the Niti Aayog meeting took place with all the states being present there. And this was mentioned as 24. It was not mentioned as 23, 24, but 24, which was not very clear. That was it 23, financial year 23, 24, or the calendar years 24. You normally don't set targets in terms of the calendar year here in our country. And if it was taken as 23, 24, it would have meant something of the nature of hubristic you mentioned, not quite achievable. That is why when we did the budget, we added one more year of 24-25, so to say, and gave 6 years over the base year for the target to be achieved, which at about 12 to 13% per annum in nominal dollar terms was quite achievable. It was ambitious, but it was quite achievable. It assumed that the rupee will not depreciate heavily against dollar, but it was quite achievable.
You're making a very important point. The initial announcement made by the Prime Minister in June of 2019, because of the vagueness of the target date, did sound hubristic. It sounded overambitious, which is why when the finance minister in her budget a few weeks later clarified and said that the target was financial year 24-25, which means it goes right up to 31st March 2025, that you believe was achievable. It might be difficult, but it was achievable. Is that the correct answer? Difficult, but achievable?
I would put it this way, that perhaps not much due diligence was done at the level of Niti Aayog at that time. when they proposed in a little bit vague terms that by 24, we will have $5 trillion economy. And I think this was fine tuning which required and which we did. And 24-25 was quite achievable, though ambitious.
Achievable, though ambitious. Now, in your book, you point out, and this is another very important point you make, India's growth story could not have been more tragic in the 2 years since the announcement of the goal of a $5 trillion economy by 24-25. So I presume that by the end of the first 2 years after the target was set, it was already clear we're going to miss it. And I take it the primary problem is COVID, but also the poor performance of the economy in 2019-20 as well. Both factors meant that we were clearly going to miss this, and we've known that for a good year or so.
That's correct. So in dollar terms, at the end of 18-19, when the dollar rupee rate was around 73.2 rupees a dollar, India's economy was close to $2.7 trillion. The next year, in 20, we grew in nominal terms by about 7%, if I remember correctly, but we depreciated about 8% vis-a-vis dollar. And therefore, the nominal growth was virtually offset by the dollar depreciation. And at the end of 1920, we were very close to, again, $2.7 trillion. Same thing happened in 2021, when the economy tanked by sort of decelerating by about 7%. Not so much in nominal terms. Nominal terms, I think the degrowth was about 2%. We made up that little bit by the dollar appreciating on that year. So as a result, again, at the end of 2021, we were at about 2.7 trillion. So the 3 years GDP of 18-19, 19-20, and 2021 was virtually stagnant, and we lost 2 years.
Absolutely. You've made a very important point there, which I'll underline for the audience, because lay people may not quite have realized the point you're making before I go on to ask my next question. India's target of becoming a $5 trillion economy, and the word dollar is critical, depends not just on the growth of the Indian economy, but it also depends upon what happens to the rupee-dollar exchange rate. And if the economy grows, but the rupee-dollar exchange rate depreciates and the dollar becomes more expensive, whatever you would achieve in terms of growth could be cancelled out by the depreciation on the other side. And the combination, in a sense, is what is also affecting us. But this brings me straight to
if I may say, in fact, the dollar depreciation trajectory has been favorable to India because we have internal domestic inflation, which is higher than the rupee-dollar depreciation. That's why, as I said in the beginning, while Indian economy in real terms grew by about 1.7% in the first 3 years, in dollar terms, it grew by 4%. So it's not a huge risk in the sense that the dollar depreciation, in fact, it's to some extent compensatory and favorable to us.
Absolutely. Even if the economy is not doing too well, the dollar depreciation saves you and takes you that little bit closer to the target. But this leads me to my last question on this particular issue. If I've read your book correctly, you estimate that by about March 31 this year, India will be a $3.09 trillion economy. That's still roughly $2 trillion less than the target of $5 trillion. When do you think we will eventually reach that $5 trillion target?
So that's correct. So the estimated GDP in nominal terms for the year 21-22 is about 230 lakh crores, which translated into dollar at 75 rupees a dollar comes to 3.09 or $3.1 trillion. That's what it is. If you want to reach to 5 trillion, you have to get additional $2 trillion of growth in dollar terms, right? You are at 3 and you want to go at 5, you require $2 trillion of growth, which on a base of 3 is roughly about 67%, or 2/3 of growth is what is required on the base of 3 trillion. Now, to get a 65 percent growth over next 5 years or 4 years, or next 5 years, let me put it this way, over the base of 21-22, you need to grow in nominal dollar terms by 13%. So again, we are, if we believe that India can grow in dollar terms at about 13%, 12 to 13% by 26-27. That is the 5 years from now, India can achieve that goal of $5 trillion economy. I think that's mathematically, arithmetically quite sort of clear, though there are lots of things it will require India to grow, India to maintain the depreciation sort of equation in such a way that you can, in nominal dollar terms, grow at about 13%.
The important point is that it will take us 5 years more, right up to 26-27, assuming we grow at 13% in nominal dollar terms to reach the target. We're not going to reach it
from 21-22.
Absolutely. We're not going to reach it in 24-25. The earliest, assuming 13% growth in nominal dollar terms, is 26-27. Let me then at that point come to a second important issue I want to raise with you. And it's a point you made in a fairly technical article that you wrote for The Wire shortly after Nirmala Sitharaman presented the budget this year. You claimed that her announcement that she had increased Capex by 2 lakh crore up to 2.9% of GDP wasn't really correct. And similar arguments or interpretations or doubts have also been raised by Mr. P. Thiagarajan, the Tamil Nadu finance minister, as well as by Neelkant Mishra, who happens to be, in fact, a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. But your critique, your questions, your doubts are the most detailed of the lot. Now, as I said, for laymen, this is a little difficult as an argument to follow. So could you, in simple terms, explain why you doubt her claim that she's increased Capex by 2 lakh crore?
I think it's not a question of doubt. It's given in the numbers which the finance minister herself presented in budget. We just need to read it carefully and in completeness. So let me try to explain what you asked me. So the central government's Capex, or the capital expenditure, is incurred from two sort of buckets, if I may say so. One is what the central government departments make expenditure, which is budgeted as the central government Capex, right? That Capex went up from the level of 5.5 lakh crores in 21-22 to 7.5 lakh crores in 22-23. And that is what the finance minister claimed as the increase of 34% plus over 5.5 lakh crores of 21-22. So as far as if you relate only to the central government budget, the claim that it increased by about 2 lakh crores and 34.5% is correct. That's not the. But the central government Capex story is not complete only with respect to what the central government spends through its own budget. Most of the central government and quite substantial central government expenditure on the Capex is incurred by the central government's public sector and the central government agencies. So agencies like railways, agencies like NHAI, agencies like BSNL, and the commercial enterprises like NTPC, Power Grid, Indian Oil Corporations, and so on. That is also the Capex, and which is given in the budget. On the first page of the budget document itself, these numbers are given. So in the Capex through the public sector and the agencies, the Capex for 22-23 has been reduced by 1.2 lakh crores. From the level of, I think, 5.8 lakh crores to 4.6 lakh crores. So in the aggregate, the central government Capex has increased only by 80,000 crores, not by 2 lakh crores. If you increase in the central government budget, but you reduce it in the central government agencies Capex, the net increase is only about 80,000 crores. And that net increase is in a way substitution. What was done by increasing 2 lakh crores was a substitution. So just to give you one example, the NHAI used to borrow from the market to raise resources for road construction, which is a Capex. Now, in the next year, and typically it does about 70,000 crores of Capex by borrowing from the market. For 22-23, the central government has asked NHAI not to borrow and is giving 70,000 crores from its own budget. So,
I've lost you, sir. You've muted yourself. You've muted yourself by accident.
No, I'm not muted.
Your voice has come back now.
All right.
Just complete.
Is that fine?
No, yeah. Please complete your point.
So what I was saying is that the NHAI expenditure Capex does not go up. 70,000 crores of Capex, which NHAI was doing from its own resources, is now being substituted by the government's Capex. So that explains that the net increase is only 80,000. But that story is not complete unless we take another device which was used in the budget. The central government decided to grant or to provide about 1 lakh crore of capital expenditure to the states. And if you take away that 1 lakh crores, which is in fact the Capex of the states, not that of the central government. The states do a Capex about 10 to 11 lakh crores every year, and they are expected to do that in 22-23. Of that, they will borrow 1 lakh crores from the central government. The rest they will borrow from elsewhere. Now, this 1 lakh crore also, they could have borrowed from elsewhere if the central government had permitted, because it uses one lever to control the state government's borrowing. So, on net basis, the increase in Capex is not there. In fact, there is a reduction of 10 to 15,000 crores.
The last point is very important. Net, and I won't repeat your two arguments because I think the audience has heard them, but net, you're saying not only is there no increase in Capex, there's actually a reduction of about 10 or 15,000 crore.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, there's one further point I want to raise with you. Part of your argument involves the belief that if the state governments do take the 1 lakh crore being made available as interest-free 50-year loans by the center, they will end up substituting it for other loans that they would otherwise have had to take if this wasn't available. So as far as the states are concerned, there's no real increase in their Capex. All that will happen is a change in where they get the money to fund it from. Rather than have to borrow it at a higher rate, they may now take it from the center because it's interest-free. But the point I want to raise with you is this, and to get your answer. Under Article 293(3) of the Constitution, if a state accepts a loan from the center, then it cannot accept further loans without the consent of the center. Now, that's a conditionality that I imagine BJP-ruled states would happily accept because they come under Mr. Modi. But what about opposition-ruled states? Would they be deterred by this conditionality?
So I think to understand this question, we'll have to go a little bit deeper into the background. So Indian states, as per our constitution, are also sovereign, and they have every right to borrow from the market, as the central government has right to borrow for its own expenditures. And Indian states have been designed in the true federal structure and the federal polity to be quite sort of capable or independent on their own. They have taxation powers, they have borrowing powers to meet their expenditures. But there are two critical limitations which have been imposed on their ability to borrow. One is that they cannot borrow abroad, right? And the second one is that if they are indebted to the central government, then they would require central government's permission to borrow. Now, this is not a new thing. This has been there in the Constitution right from the Government of India Act 1935 to the Constitution of India. Now, this first I would not discuss since today we are not discussing that perhaps. But the second issue about states' indebtedness to the central, in fact, in the first 50 years of our, or 55 years of our independent history, made the states completely dependent on the central government. The central government used to give loans for the plan purposes.
So I'm going to stop you because the audience will get lost in the detail of the history. Basically, till 2005-6, this used to be the case. State governments would borrow from the center and that would restrict their financial independence. Since 2005-6, that has stopped. They've got back their independence. They've got back what you call their sovereignty. Now, will they want to lose some of that independence and sovereignty by once again accepting cheap loans from the center?
That's correct. So what? So in 2004-5, roughly 80% of the state's borrowings came from the central government. But from 2004 onwards, the deleveraging started. The state governments were not borrowing. And by the time we were in 26, 27 or so, the states were almost freed from the central government.
So now will they want to go back into some level of financial control by the center by accepting these interest-free 1 lakh crore loans? That's the key question. What's your answer?
Yes. The answer is that these loans comes as a bait. There are two sort of attractive features. One, it's a 50-year loan. And the second one is that it's interest-free. And since most states are stressed fiscally, many states will tend to accept it. And I think the central government is using that weakness of these states to push through and to make themselves again indebted to the central government.
In other words, it's a political ploy. You're suggesting it's a political ploy, i.e. a bait, offering them cheap loans, knowing that they are stressed and will want to accept it, and therefore they will have accepted also that for 50 years, i.e. half a century, they will lose a fair measure of their fiscal independence.
Yes, because I think this goes and this ties up with the larger trend which you see of Indian federalism turning into some sort of unitary federalism, where the central government is becoming excessively sort of dominant, and the states are becoming very much of a subordinate entity.
So you're making a very important point, and this is not so much an economic point as a political point. You're saying by offering as a bait, that was your word, by offering as a bait, interest-free loans of 50-year duration to states that are stressed and therefore will be tempted to accept, the center has found a political ploy for extending its fiscal control over the states. And the weaker states, the ones whose financial health is not good, will have little option but to accept. But for 50 years, i.e. half a century, they will find that their fiscal independence is curbed or reduced. So it's a very clever political ploy.
I see it that way.
So just to sum up this particular section, what you're saying is that A, the extension of loans up to 100 lakh crore to the states for 50 years interest-free is actually a political ploy where the weaker states, those whose health is not so good, will accept and lose a fair measure of fiscal independence for a half century. Secondly, you're also saying that the actual capex is just 80,000. Because if you look at the budget in detail, a lot that would otherwise have been the capex of the public sector units controlled by the center and their agencies, as you call them.
That's inclusive of 1 lakh crores.
Absolutely.
So if you take that 1 lakh crore out, there is a net sort of reduction.
Absolutely. Now, this leads to my next question about the budget. And again, it's something you wrote about in that very technical article you wrote for The Wire. You questioned the finance minister's claim in her budget that her capex increase, or I should say now alleged capex increase, will crowd in additional private investment. You seem to have doubts about that. Can you explain this a little further, but briefly?
Two reasons for saying so. Number one, even if we believe that the capex will sort of crowd in the private investment, the capex has to increase. So if the capex is not increasing, there is no likelihood of additional crowding in. But my more substantial point on that issue is different. The assumption that the central government's capex will sort of crowd in private investment is flawed in my judgment, is not based on very sound fundamentals. And for that, we will need to look at where the central government capex goes. So the central government capex, which if you aggregate all together, which I would even see capex is one way to generate growth. So even other expenditures like PLI, etc., which are not capex in that sense, can also generate growth. So the growth is where the private industry will come in. Now, in the capex which the central government incurs, which is about 5 lakh crores, if you take out the capex on the defense purchases, etc., on the infrastructure, it's about 5 lakh crores. Now, that is primarily in railways, about 1.5 lakh, about 2 lakh crores, on roads, which is about 1.5 lakh crores, and metros in these ones, and 80,000 crores for the communications, which is BSNL and the types. Now, if you go into each one of them, you don't find that these expenditures are likely to raise private capex. Let me just take one example.
But quickly, sir, quickly and briefly, we're running out of time.
So the roads, in fact, the way we have followed the policies, the roads is not having any private participation now. Most of the roads have become completely government funded. We used to have BOTs where the private sector capex used to come, but today there are no BOT roads because the central government, by following either very high land cost, and there is very, so I think if you go into the nature of the, you don't have that time, but if you go into the nature of each one of them, these capex are not actually inducing large private sector capex.
So basically you're saying two things. One, capex can't crowd in additional private investment if the capex itself isn't there. That's the first point you made. And the second point you're making is that even if you look at where there is investment happening, it's happening in areas like roads, where the possibility of private investment coming in is very minimal or slender because private investment hasn't been involved in those areas for quite a while.
That's correct.
My last question, and I'll ask you for a brief answer because it's to do with another commitment the finance minister made in her budget. She said that what she was doing in terms of capex, as well as what she was doing additionally in terms of the production-linked incentive scheme, would create something like 60 lakh jobs over 5 years, which is roughly on average 1.2 million jobs a year. And because unemployment and joblessness is a major concern for ordinary people who want jobs and can't find them, do you believe her budget has the potential to start that process of creating 60 lakh jobs over 5 years? Or for all the reasons that you mentioned, do you doubt this as well?
See, I think we don't have that much time, but the governments create jobs in three ways. One is by creating direct jobs in the government or the public sector. That is one way of doing jobs. Second is by following policies which can allow the private sector to make investments and create jobs. And the third one is to act as a kind of stopgap or backstop, like scheme like Narega and all, where you provide some temporary jobs if the labor is not able to find that. So if you want to really look at the story of where the jobs will come, you would have to go into all these three elements. Briefly, the first element, the direct jobs in the government are not increasing. In fact, they are decreasing over the years, right? Because the government is undergoing substantial change. There is a privatization, there is a desk. So that is not the area where the jobs are getting created. In the backstop kind of arrangement, where the NREGA, the allocation used for 22-23, and that may be, since the program demand driven, increase later on. But if you take that would be the spend in 22-23, the Narega jobs would also be lower than the previous 2 years. And that brings the final point where the private industry is supposed to make investments and create jobs. That is, I think, a lot of leap of faith. If you count the way the job creation has been counted in PLI, you would perhaps find that the job creation, by the way, manufacturing is not the area where lots of jobs are getting created. So if you spend more on manufacturing, which is good for the growth, but that's not something where you can get jobs.
So in a nutshell, you do not believe that we are committed to a policy that will create 60 lakh jobs in 5 years, and you don't believe this budget has taken a solid step in that direction? Yes or no? You don't believe it?
I used out on it.
Huge doubt on it. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Garg. I'm particularly grateful to you for spending time with us and for clarifying in detail why you believe that 2 lakh crore commitment to have increased Capex is actually not so. I imagine the government will respond pretty furiously, but you have explained in detail why you think it's not so, and I'm very grateful to you. You also explained in detail why you think the target of becoming a $5 trillion economy by 24-25 is simply beyond India's reach. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.